Step into the shadows of an abandoned asylum where a hidden room reveals ghastly secrets. Will you dare to uncover the tortured souls trapped within its walls? Join us, if you're brave enough. Story 1. The Secret Room in the Asylum. This story is about a group of researchers who stumbled upon a hidden room in an abandoned psychiatric hospital. Inside, they found journals and videotapes documenting failed experiments on patients who were cruelly left to die. What began as an exploration into the past soon turned into a nightmare, as they uncovered horrors that should have remained buried. We had heard the stories about the old asylum on the outskirts of town, how it had been abandoned suddenly, its patients and staff vanished without a trace. The building had sat decaying and forgotten for decades, drawing the occasional thrill-seeker or urban explorer, but no one stayed for long. Rumors of strange noises, shadowy figures, and an oppressive atmosphere were enough to keep even the bravest at bay. For us, a group of 4 researchers with a penchant for uncovering the truth behind urban legends. The asylum was a goldmine. We had spent years documenting and debunking myths, and this place seemed like the ultimate challenge. The building was rumored to have been a site for unethical experiments during its operation, and we were determined to find evidence to support or refute these claims. The team consisted of myself, Mark, an amateur historian with a passion for unraveling mysteries; Sarah, a videographer with an eye for detail; Jason, a skeptic with a background in psychology; and Claire, a forensic specialist who had a knack for uncovering hidden clues. Together, we had explored countless abandoned buildings and haunted locations, but nothing had prepared us for what we would find inside the asylum. The day we arrived, the weather was gloomy, with thick clouds hanging low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the crumbling structure. The building loomed before us, its windows shattered and the once grand facade now marred by graffiti, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew. And as we approached, a sense of unease settled over us. We entered through a side door that had been pried open long ago. Inside, the silence was deafening. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed only by our movements, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. The first few rooms were exactly what we expected, empty, with peeling paint and broken furniture scattered about. But as we ventured deeper into the building, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. It was Jason who first noticed the door. We were in what appeared to be the administrative wing, where records and patient files would have been kept. The hallway was lined with offices, each one stripped bare. But at the end of the corridor, partially hidden behind a large filing cabinet that had been tipped over, was a door that didn't match the others. It was smaller, almost as if it had been an afterthought, and it was painted the same color as the wall, blending in so well that it was nearly invisible. "Looks like we found something interesting," Jason remarked, his usual skepticism tinged with curiosity. We moved the cabinet aside and examined the door. There was no handle, only a small keyhole, and it was locked tight. Sarah immediately set up her camera, recording every detail, while Claire began searching the nearby offices for anything that might help us open it. After what felt like hours, Claire returned with an old ring of keys she had found in a desk drawer. Most of the keys were rusted and useless, but one of them fit the lock. With a click, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. We hesitated, each of us feeling a sense of dread at what might lie below. But our curiosity and determination to uncover the truth outweighed our fear, and we descended into the unknown. The stairs were steep and narrow, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty boxes and binders, and in the center of the room was a large wooden table. On the table, neatly arranged, were several journals and a stack of videotapes. Sarah immediately began filming, while Claire and Jason started examining the journals. I picked up one of the videotapes, noting the date scribbled on the label, March 12, 1978. It was decades old, yet somehow it had survived the years in this hidden room. A sense of unease crept over me as I wondered what kind of experiments had been conducted here, and why they had been kept hidden. "These journals are patient records," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. But they're not like any records I've seen before. They're more like logs of experiments. Horrible experiments. Jason, who had been reading over her shoulder, looked pale. These were people, not test subjects. The things they did to them, it's like something out of a nightmare. I inserted the videotape into an old player we had brought along, and we gathered around the small screen as the tape began to play. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough to see the inside of what appeared to be a medical lab. A man in a white coat was speaking to the camera, his expression detached as he described the procedures being carried out on the patients. As the camera panned across the room, we saw the patients, strapped to gurneys, their faces contorted in pain and terror. The experiments were brutal, inhumane, and as the tape went on, it became clear that these people had been abandoned to die once the tests were complete. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't look away. The others were silent, their faces a mix of horror and disbelief. We had come here to uncover the truth, but this was far beyond anything we had imagined. "We need to report this," Jason finally said, his voice shaking. This is a crime. These people were tortured and left to die." But as we debated what to do next, the light suddenly flickered and we heard a noise from the staircase. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. We froze, the hairs on the back of our necks standing on end. We weren't alone. Panic set in as we realized that whatever was down here with us was getting closer. We grabbed the journals and tapes, stuffing them into our bags, and made a run for the stairs. But as we reached the door, it slammed shut, trapping us inside. The room plunged into darkness, and the footsteps stopped. We huddled together, our hearts pounding as the air grew colder and the feeling of dread intensified. Something was in the room with us. Something that didn't want us to leave. Suddenly, the videotape player switched back on, the screen flickering to life. But instead of the footage we had been watching, there was a new image. A face, twisted and distorted, staring directly at us from the screen. Its eyes were empty, black voids, and as it opened its mouth to speak, the sound that came out was a low, guttural growl. We screamed and backed away, but the face on the screen followed us, its gaze unrelenting. The growling grew louder, more intense, until it filled the room, drowning out all other sound. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the air became so thick it was hard to breathe. Just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore, the lights flickered back on, and the noise stopped. The screen went blank, and the room was silent once more. We didn't wait to find out what would happen next. We bolted for the door, wrenching it open and racing up the stairs, out of the asylum and into the cold night air. None of us spoke as we drove away, our minds reeling from what we had just experienced. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, my mind replaying the events over and over. What had we unleashed in that room? And what would happen if it followed us home? The next day, we tried to contact the authorities, but no one would listen. The asylum was a forgotten place, and the horrors that had occurred there were buried in the past, along with the people who had suffered. We were on our own. So over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Sarah's camera, which had captured everything, suddenly malfunctioned, and the footage was lost. Jason started having nightmares, seeing the face from the screen in his dreams, and Claire began to hear voices, whispers in the dark that wouldn't go away. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had made a terrible mistake. We had opened a door that should have remained closed, and now there was no going back. The door to journals and tapes we had taken remained locked away untouched. None of us dared to look at them again, fearing what else they might reveal. But deep down, I knew that we couldn't escape the truth. Whatever we had found in that secret room was not finished with us, and sooner or later, it would come for us. The days following our discovery at the asylum were filled with an uneasy silence. Each of us attempted to return to normal life, but it became clear that something had changed. In the journals and videotapes we had taken from the hidden room lay untouched in my apartment, locked away in a drawer I had no intention of opening again. But it didn't matter. The darkness we had uncovered in that abandoned place had followed us, and it wasn't bound by physical objects. It started with the nightmares. At first, they were scattered and vague, more unsettling than terrifying. Jason was the first to mention them. We were sitting in his living room trying to piece together what had happened when he suddenly grew quiet and pale. "I've been dreaming about that place," he admitted, staring at the floor. "But it's not just a dream. I can feel it, Mark. It's like I'm back there and I can't get out. And the patients, they're not dead in my dreams. They're alive, but they're suffering, begging me to help them, but I can't." His voice broke, and for the first time since we'd known each other, I saw fear in Jason's eyes. Sarah and Claire exchanged uneasy glances, and I knew that they had been experiencing the same thing. We all had, but none of us wanted to admit it. We thought that if we ignored it, maybe it would go away. It didn't. The nightmares grew worse, more vivid. Every night I found myself back in that dark, suffocating room surrounded by the tortured souls we had left behind. They called out to me, their voices echoing in my mind long after I woke up. I could see their faces, gaunt, hollow-eyed, filled with a desperate need that chilled me to the bone. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the light, but as my fingers touched the switch, I felt something cold and wet. I recoiled, flicking on the lamp, and stared in horror at my hand. It was covered in a dark, sticky substance. Blood. I jumped out of bed, my mind racing. Where had it come from? My eyes darted around the room, but there was no sign of anyone else. The blood seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to wipe it off, but it only smeared, staining my skin. The next morning I went to see Claire. She was the most rational of us, and I needed her to tell me that I was imagining things. But when I arrived at her apartment, I found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by pages torn from the journals we had taken. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "They're not just records," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're a part of it, of whatever was happening in that room. I've been reading them, Mark, and the things they describe. It's like those experiments weren't just physical. They were trying to reach something else, something beyond this world." I looked at the scattered pages, filled with illegible scrawls and strange symbols. Some of the writing was in a language I didn't recognize, and the more I stared at it, the more my head ached. "What do you mean, something beyond this world?" I asked, dreading the answer. Claire hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. They were experimenting on their minds, trying to break down the barriers between our reality and something else. Something dark, malevolent. I think they succeeded, at least partially, and whatever they unleashed, it's still there. It's waiting for us. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, a side effect of the stress we'd been under, but deep down I knew she was right. We had crossed a line, delved into something that should have remained buried, and now it was coming for us. I stayed with Claire, that night too afraid to be alone. We didn't speak much, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fears. Around midnight, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep on her couch, I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around the dark room. The whispering seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding me in a cold, suffocating embrace. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, accusing. I scrambled to my feet, feeling a surge of panic. "Claire?" She appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "You hear it too, don't you?" I nodded, unable to speak. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming more distinct, though still in that strange guttural language. It was like the walls themselves were speaking, filled with the voices of the tortured souls we had disturbed. "We have to get out of here," I said, grabbing my coat. "This place, it's not safe." Claire didn't argue. We fled into the night, the whispering following us, growing fainter the farther we got from her apartment. We ended up at Sarah's house, where we found her and Jason already wide awake, their faces etched with the same fear that gripped us. "We're not safe anywhere," Jason said, his voice hoarse. "It's not just in our heads, Mark. This thing, whatever it is, it's real, and it's getting stronger. Sarah nodded in agreement. It's not just the whispering. I've seen things, shadows that shouldn't be there, and when I close my eyes, I see their faces. The patients. They're trying to tell us something, but I don't know what. We need to destroy those journals and tapes, Claire said suddenly. They're the link. As long as we have them, it has power over us. The suggestion made sense, but the idea of burning those documents, destroying the only evidence of what we had found, filled me with a deep sense of unease. What if destroying them made things worse? What if whatever was haunting us became even more enraged? But we had no other options. That night, we gathered the journals and videotapes, piling them in Sarah's backyard. The four of us stood around the makeshift pyre, the cold night air biting at our skin. I struck a match and dropped it onto the pile. The flames caught quickly, the old dry paper and film feeding the fire. We watched in silence as the journals and tapes were consumed, the flames crackling and dancing in the darkness. For a moment I felt a flicker of hope that this might be the end of it. But as the fire burned, a gust of wind blew through the yard, scattering the ashes and sending a wave of cold air over us. In that moment I felt it, the presence stronger than before, surrounding us. And then we heard it, a low, mournful wail coming from the shadows just beyond the firelight. It was a sound that cut through to the bone, filled with unimaginable pain and sorrow. The flames flickered, casting eerie, distorted shadows on the ground. We backed away from the fire, our hearts pounding. The wailing grew louder, more anguished, until it was all we could hear. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around us. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. Then, out of the darkness, they appeared. Figures barely more than silhouettes, but unmistakably human. They moved slowly, painfully, as if every step was a struggle. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and they were reaching out to us, their hands twisted and broken. "Please, help us." The words were barely a whisper, but they were clear enough. It was the same plea we had heard in our nightmares, the same desperate need that had haunted us since we left the asylum. "We can't help you," Jason said, his voice trembling. "We tried, but we can't." The figures didn't stop. They kept coming, their wailing growing louder, more intense. The ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. "We have to go," Claire whispered, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of wails and whispers. The figures were closer now, their twisted hands reaching for us. I could see the pain etched on their faces, the torment that had followed them even in death. They were the patients, the ones who had been tortured and abandoned in that secret room. And they were demanding justice. Justice we couldn't give them. In a blind panic, we turned and ran, leaving the fire and the figures behind. The wailing followed us, echoing in the night as we fled through the streets. We didn't stop until we reached my apartment, slamming the door behind us, as if that could keep the darkness out. We huddled together in the living room, too shaken to speak. The wailing had faded, but the sense of dread lingered, heavy and oppressive. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to keep coming until we give them what they want." "But what do they want?" Jason asked, his voice breaking. "We can't bring them back. We can." Claire was silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. Maybe it's not about undoing it. Maybe they just want someone to acknowledge what happened to them, to remember them, to tell their story. It was a grim thought, but it made sense. Those patients had been forgotten, their suffering erased from history, buried in that hidden room. They were crying out for someone to hear them, to recognize the horrors they had endured. But how could we do that without losing ourselves in the process? The more we delved into their story, the more we risked becoming trapped in the same darkness that had claimed them. "We have to go back," I said finally, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We have to return to the asylum, finish what we started." Claire stared at me in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind?" Jason demanded. "You want to go back to that place? After everything that's happened?" "I don't want to," I admitted. "But I think Claire's right. We need to acknowledge what happened to those patients. We need to face whatever is haunting us, or it's going to keep following us, maybe even get worse. It took a long time to convince them, but in the end, we all knew there was no other choice. We gathered what little courage we had left and made a plan to return to the asylum. This time, we would be prepared. We would bring flashlights, namas, anything that could help us document what we found. And we would do it together. No one would be left alone. The next day, we set out for the asylum, our hearts heavy with dread. The journey felt different this time, as if the landscape itself had changed, grown darker and more foreboding. By the time we reached the rusted gates, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the crumbling buildings. We stood in silence for a moment, gathering our resolve. Then, with a deep breath, we pushed open the gates and stepped inside. The asylum was as we had left it, abandoned and decaying, but there was a palpable tension in the air, as if the very walls were watching us. We made our way through the labyrinthine hallways, the memories of our last visit flooding back with every step. Finally, we reached the secret room. The door was still ajar, the darkness inside seeming to pulse with a life of its own. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob before pushing it open and stepping inside. The room was as we remembered it, but now in the dim light of our flashlights, it seemed even more sinister. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and writhe, and the air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. We set up our cameras, the lenses focused on the altar and the blood-stained walls. Then, with a deep breath, I began to speak. "My name is Mark, and I'm here to tell your story," I said, my voice trembling. "We know what happened to you. We've seen the records, the tapes. We know about the experiments, the torture, the suffering, and we're here to acknowledge it, to remember you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. I could only hope that it was enough. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, slowly, the temperature began to drop, the cold seeping into our bones. The shadows on the walls grew darker, more distinct, and I realized with a jolt of fear that they were taking shape. The figures emerged from the walls, their forms coalescing into the twisted, broken bodies of the patients. Their faces were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and filled with a deep, unbearable pain. "We remember," the voice was barely a whisper, but it resonated through the room, sending chills down my spine. "We remember." The figures moved toward us, their steps slow and deliberate. I fought the urge to run, forcing myself to stand my ground. "We're here to help you," I said, though my voice was shaking. "We want to tell your story to make sure no one forgets what happened to you." The figures stopped, their hollow eyes fixed on us. For a moment, the air was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint sound of our breathing. Then, one by one, the figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal, and the sense of dread that had filled the air began to lift. It was over. We stood there in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. Had we really appeased the spirits, or had we simply opened ourselves up to something far worse? We didn't wait to find out. Gathering our equipment, we left the asylum, the weight of what we had experienced pressing down on us. None of us spoke on the drive back, each lost in our own thoughts. When we finally returned to my apartment, we reviewed the footage we had taken. The video was clear, the figures and their movements captured in stark detail. There was no denying what we had seen, no way to rationalize it away. We shared the footage online, anonymously, hoping that by telling the story, we could finally put the past to rest. But even as I uploaded the files, I knew that the darkness we had encountered wasn't so easily dispelled. In the weeks that followed, the nightmares slowly began to fade, but the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of something much deeper, much darker. And then, one night, I woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, creeping through the darkness like a shadow. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. "We remember." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was the same voice we had heard in the asylum, the same voice that had haunted my dreams. I jumped out of bed, my eyes darting around the room, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. We remember everything. I tried to block it out, to convince myself that it was just a lingering effect of the trauma we had experienced. But deep down, I knew the truth. We had opened a door that should have remained closed. We had delved into something we didn't understand, something that had now taken root in our lives. And no matter what we did, no matter how hard we tried to escape, it would never let us go. The darkness we had uncovered in that secret room had followed us home, and it wasn't finished with us yet. We had told their story, but in doing so, we had become a part of it. Now we were the ones trapped in a nightmare with no end, haunted by the ghosts of the past we had awakened. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that we would never be free of them. The whispering would continue, the shadows would grow longer, and the darkness would consume us, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Because in the end, the past never truly dies. It just waits, patiently, for someone to dig it up. And we had dug too deep. Story 2. Dolls in an abandoned house. The story I'm about to tell is one that has haunted my dreams ever since it happened. I was part of a small group of urban explorers, people who seek out abandoned places and document what we find. We never expected our curiosity to lead us to a discovery, so terrifying that it would change our lives forever. We found an old mansion, long forgotten by time, with a room filled with dolls that seemed to hold the souls of those who once lived. But it wasn't just the dolls that unnerved us. It was the photographs, photos of people who lived in the house before and after some unspeakable tragedy. This is the story of what we found in that house and why none of us will ever be the same. It started like any other exploration. We were a group of 5, each of us with our own reasons for being drawn to abandoned places. For some, it was the thrill of the unknown. For others, like me, it was a fascination with history, with the stories these forgotten places could tell. That's how we ended up standing in front of the old stone mirror mansion, a place that had been abandoned for decades, if not longer. The mansion was hidden deep in the woods, far from any roads or paths. We had to hike for hours just to reach it, guided only by an old map we found online. When we finally saw it through the trees, we were struck by its sheer size and the sense of isolation it exuded. The mansion was a grand, Gothic structure with tall, pointed arches and stone walls that had turned almost black from years of exposure to the elements. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. We stepped inside, and immediately the temperature seemed to drop. The air was thick with dust, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. The furniture was still in place, covered in white sheets that had long since turned gray. The whole place felt frozen in time, as if the inhabitants had left in a hurry and never returned. We split up to explore the different rooms. I found myself drawn to the upper floor, where the bedrooms were. The wood creaked under my feet as I made my way down the hallway, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. Most of the rooms were empty, with nothing but the decaying remains of beds and dressers. But then I came to a door at the end of the hall that was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, much smaller than the others, and it was filled with dolls. Hundreds of them, lining the walls, sitting on shelves, staring at me with their lifeless eyes. Some were old and faded, with cracked porcelain faces and frayed clothing. Others looked almost new, as if they had been added to the collection recently. I felt a chill run down my spine as I moved further into the room. There was something deeply unsettling about those dolls. It wasn't just their numbers, but the way they seemed to be watching me, their eyes following me as I moved. I tried to shake off the feeling and took out my camera to document the room. That's when I noticed the photographs. They were scattered on the floor, old black and white photos that had yellowed with age. I picked one up and studied it. It showed a family. Parents with their 2 children, a boy and a girl. They were standing in front of the mansion, smiling at the camera. But there was something off about their expressions, something that didn't seem quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made me uneasy. I picked up another photo and my heart skipped a beat. It was the same family, but this time they looked different. Their smiles were gone, replaced by blank, emotionless expressions. The father's eyes were hollow, as if all the life had been drained out of him. The mother looked terrified, her face twisted in a silent scream. The children were the worst. They were holding hands, their faces pale and gaunt, with dark circles under their eyes. I dropped the photo and backed away, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. One of the dolls, a little girl with curly blonde hair and a pink dress, was sitting on the bed. I could have sworn she hadn't been there before. Her eyes were wide open, staring straight at me, and for a moment I thought I saw them move. I stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran down the hallway, calling out for the others. When I found them, I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. They could see the fear in my eyes, though, and we decided it was time to leave. But as we made our way back to the front door, something strange happened. The temperature dropped even further, and a thick fog began to roll in from outside. We could barely see 2 feet in front of us, and the air was so cold it burned our lungs. We tried to find our way out, but the fog was disorienting, and we kept ending up back in the same place. That's when we heard the whispering. It started off faint, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the dolls. The voices were all around us, whispering in a language we didn't understand. We huddled together, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, until they were all we could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The fog lifted, and we were standing in the middle of the entrance hall. The front door was right in front of us, wide open. We didn't hesitate. We ran out of that house as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back in the woods, far away from the mansion. None of us spoke on the way back. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen, what we had experienced. It was something we'd never forget, something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. But the story doesn't end there. When we got back to town, we started looking into the history of the mansion. What we found out was more horrifying than anything we could have imagined. The family in the photos, James and Eliza Bennett and their children, Thomas and Mary, had lived in the mansion in the early 1900s. They were a wealthy family, well respected in the community, but their lives were far from perfect. According to the records, James Bennett had become obsessed with the occult in the years leading up to his death. He was convinced that the mansion was cursed, that it was haunted by the spirits of those who had lived there before him. He started performing rituals, trying to communicate with the spirits to make them leave. But instead of getting rid of them, he seemed to invite them in. The family's descent into madness was well documented. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the mansion at all hours of the night. Visitors to the house spoke of seeing figures in the windows, shadows that didn't belong to anyone. And then one night, the entire family disappeared. No one knows what happened to them. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The more we dug, the more we realized that the Bennett family wasn't the only one to suffer such a fate. Every family that had lived in the mansion before them had met a similar end. Tragic deaths, mysterious disappearances, unexplained accidents. It was as if the house itself was cursed, and the dolls were there long before the Bennetts moved in. Each one of them, it seemed, represented a life that had been lost in that house. A soul trapped within its walls, unable to move on. We were lucky to get out of there alive. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that we brought something back with us. Something dark, something evil. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear the whispers. They're faint, barely audible, but they're there just waiting for the right moment to strike. The weeks that followed our escape from Stoner Mansion were a blur of restless nights and gnawing paranoia. Each of us tried to return to our normal lives, but it quickly became apparent that we had left a part of ourselves behind in that cursed house. Or worse, we had brought something back with us, stirred with the nightmares. Every night, I found myself back in that doll-filled room, the air thick with the scent of decay and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of whispering. The dolls would come to life in my dreams, their eyes following my every move, their heads turning slowly to face me. But it wasn't just the dreams that tormented me. Every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I would see a shadow dart across the room or hear a soft childlike giggle echoing through the halls of my apartment. I wasn't the only one. The others in our group reported similar experiences. We were all being haunted, and the more we tried to ignore it, the worse it got. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to go through the photographs I had taken in the mansion. I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could find something that would explain what was happening to us. As I flipped through the images, one picture caught my eye. It was a shot of the room with the dolls, taken from the doorway. In the corner of the photo, I could just make out a shadowy figure standing by the bed, where the little girl doll had been sitting. The figure was barely visible, almost blending in with the darkness, but it was there, a human shape, watching me. My blood ran cold as I stared at the photo. How had I not seen it before? I zoomed in, trying to make out more details, but the image only grew blurrier. The more I looked, the more the figure seemed to take on the shape of a man, tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to glow with a faint, eerie light. I could feel those eyes on me even through the screen, and I quickly shut my laptop, my heart racing. The next morning, I called the others and told them what I had found. We met up at a local cafe, all of us looking worse for wear. Dark circles had formed under our eyes, and our conversations were filled with nervous glances over our shoulders. As we sat down, I pulled out my laptop and showed them the photo. Their reactions were immediate, expressions of shock, fear, and disbelief. "We need to go back, Sarah," one of the group members said suddenly. Her voice was shaky, but there was a determination in her eyes. "We need to find out what's really going on in that house. If we don't, this will never stop." The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. The thought of returning to that place filled us with dread, but deep down, we knew she was right. Whatever curse the mansion held, it had latched onto us, and the only way to break it was to confront it. We decided to return the following weekend. This time, we came prepared, not just with cameras and flashlights, but with items we hoped would protect us. A crucifix, a handful of salt, and a Bible. Small comforts in the face of the unknown. As we approached the mansion, the air grew colder, and the fog thickened, just as it had the first time. The front door stood open as if waiting for us. Inside, the mansion was exactly as we had left it, but the atmosphere was different. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath our feet. We made our way up the stairs, the light from our flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. When we reached the room with the dolls, we found it just as we had left it, except for one thing. The dolls had been moved. They were no longer sitting on the shelves or scattered across the floor. Instead, they were arranged in a circle in the center of the room, facing inward. In the middle of the circle lay a single photograph, the edges curled and yellowed with age. I picked it up and felt a chill run down my spine. It was a photo of our group, standing in front of the mansion on the day of our first visit. But there was something wrong with the image. Our faces were distorted, our eyes dark and hollow, just like the family in the old photographs. In the background, just barely visible in the shadow of the doorway, was the figure I'd seen in my photo. The same tall, thin man with glowing eyes. "We need to leave, Mark," another member of the group whispered. His voice was trembling, and I could see the fear in his eyes. We should never have come back. But before we could turn to go, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The temperature plummeted, and the room was plunged into darkness. We heard the dolls whispering, their voices rising in a cacophony of incomprehensible words. The walls seemed to close in on us, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room was deathly silent, the air thick with tension. We stood frozen in place, too afraid to move. Then, out of the darkness, a voice spoke, a deep, gravelly voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice seemed to come from all around us, echoing off the walls. I turned, trying to locate the source, but there was no one there. Just the dolls, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. The voice spoke again, louder this time, filled with anger. "You are not welcome here." Panic set in. and we scrambled for the door trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The voice laughed, a low, sinister sound that echoed through the room. Leave now and never return. With a sudden crash, the door flew open, and we stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. We didn't stop to look back. We ran down the stairs, through the front door, and into the foggy night, as the air outside was cold and damp, but it felt like a relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, where we finally collapsed, our hearts pounding in our chests. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We all knew what we had experienced, and we all knew we could never speak of it to anyone else. As we made our way back to the car, the fog began to lift, and for a moment, I thought I saw something standing in the doorway of the mansion. A tall, thin figure watching us with glowing eyes. But when I blinked, it was gone, and I told myself it was just my imagination. The ride back to town was silent. We were all lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events of the night over and over in our minds. When we finally reached the safety of our homes, we made a pact to never return to Stonemere Mansion, to forget what we had seen and try to move on with our lives. But it wasn't that easy. The nightmares continued, growing more vivid with each passing night. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of the mansion fresh in my mind. Sometimes I would hear the voice from the mansion, whispering to me in the dark, telling me that I was never going to escape, and the others experienced the same thing. We tried to support each other, but it was clear that the mansion had left its mark on us. We were haunted by the memory of what we had seen, by the knowledge that something evil was still out there, waiting for the next group of explorers to stumble upon its lair. In the end, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She was the first to break, her mind unraveling under the constant torment. She started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, dolls appearing in her home, their lifeless eyes following her every move. She became convinced that the spirit from the mansion had followed her home, that it was trying to claim her. One night she disappeared. Her family found her apartment empty, her belongings untouched. The only thing out of place was a single doll sitting on her bed with a photograph tucked under its arm. The photo was of Sarah, standing in front of the mansion, her face twisted in fear. After Sarah's disappearance, the rest of us knew we had to do something. We couldn't let the curse of the mansion destroy us all. We began researching ways to break the curse, consulting with experts in the paranormal, priests, anyone who might have answers. But the more we searched, the more hopeless it seemed. The mansion's evil was too powerful, too ancient to be easily banished. In the end, we knew there was only one option left. We had to go back one last time, confront whatever was haunting the mansion, and put an end to it once and for all. It was a suicide mission, and we all knew it. But we couldn't live in fear anymore. We had to try. We returned to the mansion on a moonless night, armed with everything we could think of. Holy water, salt, crosses, anything that might give us an edge. The air was thick with tension as we approached the front door, which was once again open, waiting for us. Inside, the mansion was even darker and more oppressive than before. The walls seemed to close in on us as we made our way through the hallways, the only sound our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. We reached the room with the dolls, which now seemed even more foreboding. The dolls were still arranged in their eerie circle, the photograph from our previous visit lying in the center. The atmosphere was heavier, more charged with malevolent energy. We set up our equipment around the room, the cameras, voice recorders, and protective items. The plan was to document everything we encountered and try to find a way to dispel the evil. We began by reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water around the room, hoping to create a barrier between us and whatever was lurking within the mansion. As we worked, the room grew colder, the temperature dropping noticeably. The whispers started again, soft and sinister, but this time they were accompanied by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions. The dolls' eyes seemed to follow us, their heads turning ever so slightly as if tracking our movements. Mark, the most skeptical of the group, was the first to break under the pressure. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. He began to mumble incoherently, his eyes wide with terror. "It's not right," he kept repeating. It's not right. Suddenly, one of the dolls, a particularly old and decrepit one with a cracked face and tattered dress, began to move on its own. It shuffled across the floor, its eyes fixed on us. The sight was enough to make even the most hardened of us shudder. We gathered closer, trying to stay focused, despite the rising fear. I looked around the room, searching for anything that could give us a clue as to how to break the curse. That's when I noticed something odd about the photograph from our previous visit. It seemed to have changed. The faces of my friends and me were now twisted with anguish, our eyes hollow and empty, just like the Bennetts in the old photos. Before I could say anything, a loud crash echoed through the room. A shelf had fallen, sending a cascade of dolls and debris to the floor. The room was suddenly filled with a blinding light, and the whispers grew deafening. We could barely hear each other over the cacophony of voices and the roar of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. In the midst of the chaos, a figure appeared in the doorway. A tall, thin man with glowing eyes, just as I had seen in the photograph. His presence was overwhelming, filling the room with an almost tangible sense of dread. He spoke, his voice a deep, resonant tone that seemed to shake the very walls. "You are meddling in forces beyond your understanding," he intoned. "This place has claimed many souls, and it will not let you go so easily." We tried to respond, to confront him, but the words caught in our throats. The figure seemed to be absorbing the light around him, making the room darker with each passing second. We could barely see, our flashlights flickering as the darkness closed in. Desperate, we clung to our protective items, trying to push back against the darkness. We chanted prayers, sprinkled more holy water, and used every ounce of strength and willpower we had to fight back. The figure seemed to grow stronger with each attempt, his form becoming more defined, more menacing. Suddenly, the temperature in the room shot up, and the light returned, blindingly bright. The figure let out a scream, a sound of pure rage and anguish, and then he was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting as quickly as it had descended. We stood there, exhausted and shaken, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The dolls were still, their eyes no longer following us. The air felt lighter, as if the malevolent presence had been driven out, at least for now. Out of trembling hands, we gathered our equipment and made our way out of the mansion. We didn't look back, knowing that any further exploration might bring us face to face with the evil we had just barely escaped. The fog outside had lifted, revealing a clear, starry sky. It felt like a blessing, a sign that we had managed to push back the darkness, if only temporarily. As we drove away from the mansion, we made a vow to never return. The experiences we had faced in Stumwere Mansion had left an indelible mark on us. We had confronted something dark and powerful, something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. We would carry the memory of the dolls and the figure with glowing eyes. For in the days and weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal, but the sense of unease remained. We continued to experience nightmares and unsettling occurrences, reminders of our encounter with the supernatural. We tried to find solace in the knowledge that we had confronted the evil, but the fear never fully dissipated. The mansion remained abandoned, a dark and brooding presence on the edge of the woods. We knew that it would always be there, waiting for the next group of explorers to stumble into its grasp. And though we had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale, we couldn't shake the feeling that something of us had been left behind, trapped within the haunted walls of Stumwere Mansion. Story 3. The Forgotten Summer Camp. The idea was simple enough. A weekend escape from the grind of our everyday lives. My friends and I, all in our early 40s, were craving something different. When we heard about an abandoned summer camp deep in the forest, it seemed like the perfect adventure. Rumor had it that children had mysteriously vanished from the camp decades ago, leaving behind an unsettling legacy. Intrigued by these stories and the chance to delve into a piece of forgotten history, we set out unaware of the dark truths we were about to uncover. Myself, Michael, a longtime friend and seasoned outdoorsman. Linda, my wife, whose curiosity and knack for discovery often led us to fascinating finds. James, a history buff with a deep interest in urban legends. And Claire, a pragmatic skeptic whose fascination with the unknown often led her to test her own limits. We were all eager to explore, but none of us anticipated the gravity of what lay ahead. The journey to the camp was challenging. The forest seemed almost to close in around us as we followed an overgrown trail, barely distinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. The air was heavy with humidity, and the distant calls of wildlife provided an eerie backdrop to our trek. After hours of navigating through thick underbrush and tangled roots, we finally emerged into a clearing. The sight before us was both intriguing and disquieting. A series of dilapidated cabins and tents, their once vibrant colors now faded and mottled with moss. It was as if time had forgotten this place, leaving it to be slowly reclaimed by nature. The camp's central lodge, a large wooden structure with a sagging roof and broken windows, loomed over the site like a forlorn sentinel. Inside the lodge, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and abandonment. Dust covered every surface, and broken furniture lay scattered as if hastily discarded. We found old murals on the walls, faded drawings of smiling children engaged in various camp activities. Among the remnants were a few old, rusty metal lockers. We pried them open, but they were mostly empty, save for a few scattered yellow documents. It was outside, however, where we made our most intriguing discoveries. As we explored the grounds, we came across a cluster of tents, their canvas weathered and covered in a thick layer of moss. They looked almost like giant, slumbering creatures hidden beneath a green shroud. Eager to see what secrets they held, we decided to investigate. The first tent we entered was barely intact. Inside, we found old sleeping bags, their fabric disintegrated and filled with mold. The floor was littered with broken toys and discarded camp gear. In the corner, partially buried under a pile of debris, was an old leather-bound diary. Its cover was worn and cracked, but the pages inside were surprisingly well preserved. The diary was written in a child's scrawl, filled with descriptions of camp activities, friendships, and the excitement of summer days. But as we read further, the entries took a darker turn. The final few pages described a growing sense of unease and fear. And the last entry, dated just before the camp's sudden closure, was a chilling warning. "We hear things at night. There's something out there. Don't stay after dark." We shared our findings with the group, the mood growing more serious with each revelation. Despite the warnings, our curiosity drove us to continue exploring. We came across another tent, similar in appearance but with a more unsettling find. An old wooden box covered in dust and cobwebs lay hidden beneath a rotting pile of leaves. Inside, we discovered several more diaries, each with its own unique handwriting and stories of camp life. One diary was particularly disturbing. It described strange occurrences, shadows moving in the dark, whispers carried by the wind, and an inexplicable feeling of being watched. The final entry was a desperate plea. "Something is wrong. We need to leave before nightfall. Whatever it is, it's coming," says. Twilight began to set in. The camp transformed. The once inviting spaces now seemed dark and foreboding. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp. We decided to regroup and discuss our next steps. Michael, who had been unusually quiet, suggested that we heed the warnings and leave before it got any darker. His suggestion was met with mixed reactions. While some of us were eager to leave, others were reluctant to abandon our quest. We split into pairs to cover more ground, and I teamed up with Linda, and we decided to explore the old cabins that were situated on the outskirts of the camp. As we entered the first cabin, we were struck by the sense of abandonment. The interior was filled with broken furniture, old camp gear, and a thick layer of dust. On one wall, we noticed a series of scratches, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the wood. The atmosphere was heavy and the silence was almost oppressive. As we moved through the cabin, Linda stumbled upon a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, we found a small, dusty box. When we opened it, we were shocked to find several old photographs. The images showed children in camp uniforms, but something was off. The faces of the children were oddly distorted, and in one photo a shadowy figure loomed in the background, partially obscured but unmistakably malevolent. The shadows seemed to lengthen as nightfall approached. The forest around us grew darker, and the camp took on an eerie quality. The silence was occasionally broken by strange noises. A distant, rhythmic thudding, the rustling of leaves as if something moved just out of sight. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, creating long, wavering beams that danced across the day. As night fell, the atmosphere grew increasingly unsettling. The once familiar camp now felt alien, almost hostile. The sense of being watched was palpable, and the warnings in the diaries seemed more relevant than ever. The camp's remnants, now shrouded in darkness, appeared to hold a sinister energy that we could not ignore. We regrouped once more, our earlier excitement replaced by a palpable sense of dread. The camp's eerie silence was broken only by the occasional, inexplicable noise. We could hear whispers in the wind, but the source remained unseen. The feeling that we were not alone grew stronger with each passing minute. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The camp, once a place of joy and laughter, had become a place of nightmares. The warnings left by the children were a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked here, and the sense of foreboding was impossible to ignore. The darkness brought with it a feeling of impending doom, and the camp's secrets seemed to come alive, ready to reveal themselves in the dead of night. We were caught between curiosity and fear, unable to leave, but also unable to ignore the growing sense of danger. The camp had become a place where the past and present intertwined, where the remnants of a lost summer camp spoke of something far darker than we had ever imagined. And as we faced the unknown, we could only hope that we would uncover the truth before it was too late. The chill of the night seemed to seep into our bones as we huddled together in the central lodge, seeking refuge from the encroaching darkness. The once familiar setting of the camp now felt like a living entity, its oppressive silence punctuated by unsettling noises that kept us on edge. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and every shadow seemed to conceal something sinister. As we discussed our next steps, the weight of the warnings in the diaries pressed heavily upon us. Michael's earlier suggestion to leave was met with agreement, but as we prepared to pack up, the camp seemed to resist our departure. The whispers in the wind grew louder, and the shadows around us seemed to move with a life of their own. And we decided to spend the night in the central lodge, hoping that staying in one place would help us make sense of the strange occurrences. We set up makeshift sleeping areas on the dusty floor, our flashlights casting flickering beams that barely penetrated the darkness. The lodge, once a place of communal joy, now felt like a crypt, its silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. Linda and Claire took the first watch, while James and I attempted to get some rest. As I lay on the floor, the sound of distant rustling and the occasional thud seemed to come from all directions. My mind raced with thoughts of the camp's dark history and the warnings left by the children. I tried to push these thoughts aside and focus on sleep, but every sound and shadow kept me on high alert. Hours passed slowly, and the unease in the lodge grew. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it whispers that seemed to echo through the empty space. The feeling of being watched intensified, and every small noise, whether a creak of the floorboards or a gust of wind, felt magnified in the oppressive darkness. Around midnight, the atmosphere in the lodge took on a new level of intensity. The temperature dropped suddenly, and we could see our breath fogging up in the cold air. Linda and Claire, having noticed the temperature change, grew increasingly anxious. They reported hearing strange noises outside the lodge, but when we investigated, there was nothing visible, only the same oppressive silence and darkness. James and I decided to venture outside to see if we could identify the source of the noises. Armed with flashlights and a sense of determination, we stepped out into the cold night air. The campgrounds were bathed in moonlight, casting eerie shadows that danced across the dilapidated structures. The forest surrounding the camp seemed to close in around us, the trees swaying with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. As we walked through the camp, the sense of dread grew stronger. The shadows seemed to move and shift with a life of their own, and every crackling branch or rustling leaf felt like a threat. We approached the old fire pit we had seen earlier, its stones now illuminated by the moonlight. The pit was eerily quiet, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. James, always the history enthusiast, began to examine the remnants around the fire pit more closely. He uncovered a few more old photographs, similar to those we had found earlier, but these were different. They depicted children in various poses, but in the background of each photo was a dark, indistinct figure, always just out of focus, but unmistakably present. The figure seemed to appear in every photograph, growing more distinct with each new image. As we continued our investigation, sounds around us grew louder. It was as if the forest itself was coming alive with an unsettling energy. We heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind us, but when we turned, there was no one there. The feeling of being followed was pervasive, and our sense of unease only deepened. We decided to return to the lodge, our nerves frayed and our sense of safety eroded. The lodge, however, was no longer a sanctuary. The temperature inside had dropped further, and the cold seemed to penetrate our very bones. The shadows in the lodge grew darker, and the whispers we had heard earlier became clearer, forming indistinct words that seemed to carry a warning. As we gathered together, we noticed that the once quiet lodge was now filled with the sound of scratching. The noise came from all directions, a relentless gnawing sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and the sense of dread became almost unbearable. Claire, who had been the most skeptical of us all, began to panic. Her fear was palpable, and she urged us to leave immediately. We were all on edge, but the thought of staying any longer seemed unbearable. We began to gather our belongings, our movements hurried and frantic. As we prepared to leave, the scratching noise reached a crescendo. It was as if something was trying to break through the walls of the lodge. We could hear it moving closer, and the shadows in the lodge seemed to come alive, stretching and shifting with a malevolent intent. And the whispers grew louder, forming a coherent message that we could finally understand. Leave us in a state of sheer panic, we bolted from the lodge, our flashlights casting erratic beams as we navigated the darkened camp. The forest around us was thick with shadows, and the path we had taken earlier was now obscured by the darkness. We stumbled through the underbrush, the sounds of the forest growing more intense and chaotic. The journey back to the trailhead was fraught with tension. We could hear the sounds of something following us, its presence a constant, oppressive weight on our minds. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump, and the sense of being pursued was relentless. As we emerged from the forest and reached the safety of our vehicles, we breathed a collective sigh of relief. The camp, now a dark silhouette in the distance, seemed to watch us as we drove away. The feeling of being watched did not dissipate until we were well away from the campgrounds. The darkness of the forest slowly receding as we put more distance between ourselves and the place of our fears. The experience left us shaken, but it also left us with more questions than answers. The camp's dark history and the eerie warnings left by the children remained with us, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked in the forgotten corners of the world. The summer camp, once a place of childhood joy, had revealed itself as something far more sinister, a place where the past and present collided in a chilling dance of shadows and whispers. And we recounted our experiences in the days that followed. We realized that the camp story was far from over. The mysteries we had uncovered were only the beginning, and the camp's dark secrets were destined to remain unresolved, hidden within the depths of the forest and the echoes of a forgotten past.